My stepmother ordered security to remove me from my late mother's inn. This is a family event, leave. But later, my lawyer handed her a trust document. She owns everything. You are just an operator. The gold digger never expected that. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I still remember the sound of polished dress shoes walking across the marble floor behind me. They belonged to two security guards who had just been told to escort me out of the inn my mother had spent half her life building. This is a family event, my stepmother said calmly. Please leave. She didn't need to raise her voice. Everyone in the ballroom was already watching. I looked at my father, hoping he would say something, anything. Instead, he avoided my eyes. Eleanor, please don't make a scene. So I walked out. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't even look back. But to explain why I was standing there in the first place, I have to go back a few days. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I'm 35 years old, and I work as a boutique interior design consultant in Boston. Most of my clients know I love restoring old spaces instead of tearing them down. What they don't know is where that passion came from. I grew up watching my mother breathe life into old buildings. She always said every place had a memory. If you listened carefully enough, it would tell you what it wanted to become. Back then, I thought she was just being poetic. Now I know she was teaching me how to preserve history. One Tuesday afternoon, I was reviewing fabric samples when my coworker Rachel stopped by my office. Eleanor, can I ask you something? Sure. Is your family connected to Seabrook Manor? I looked up. I saw an article about their 35th anniversary gala. Same last name. I nodded. It used to be. Rachel looked surprised. Wait, that's your family's place? It was my mother's. She waited for more. I stayed quiet. I've heard it's one of the nicest historic inns on the Maine coast. It is. You never talk about it. I smiled politely. Because it stopped feeling like home a long time ago. Rachel immediately apologized. It's okay. People always assumed there had been one huge family fight. The truth was simpler. 5 years earlier, I stopped showing up. Every visit became another argument about what my mother would have wanted. Eventually, leaving felt easier than fighting. So I built my own life. A small apartment, a business from scratch. Long nights, difficult clients, and projects that somehow always worked out in the end. Everything I had, I earned myself. No family money, just work. That evening, I found a thick, cream-colored envelope on my desk. No return address, only my name. Inside was a single invitation. Seabrook Manor, 35th anniversary celebration Saturday evening. Formal attire, no note, no signature. I turned the card over twice. Nothing. I couldn't tell if it was an invitation or a warning. For 3 days it sat on my kitchen counter while I kept telling myself I wasn't going. Then one question kept coming back. Was anything my mother built still there? Not the guest rooms, not the gardens. I meant her, the photographs, the traditions, the brass plaque she insisted every guest should see when they walked through the front doors. I hadn't seen any of it in years. By Friday night, curiosity had quietly replaced my stubbornness. I packed one overnight bag and pulled out the only formal dress I still owned. Early Saturday morning, I started driving toward the Maine coast. As the highway stretched ahead, I tightened my grip on the steering wheel and whispered to myself, one night, that's all. The closer I got to the Maine coast, the more familiar everything looked. The winding roads, the smell of salt in the air. Even the weather felt exactly the way I remembered. Gray skies that somehow made the ocean look even more beautiful. I rolled my window down for a minute and let the breeze in. 5 years wasn't long enough to erase a place like this. Before driving to Seabrook Manor, I stopped in the little downtown area where my mom used to buy fresh flowers every Saturday morning. Some of the storefronts had changed. A new bakery had replaced the old bookstore. The hardware store had a fresh coat of paint. But most of the town still looked like itself. I parked near the harbor and decided to walk for a while. Nobody expected me. That made it easier. As I passed a small cafe, someone called my name. Eleanor? I turned around. An older woman stood outside arranging flower pots. For a second I couldn't place her. Then she smiled. I knew it was you. Mrs. Donnelly? She laughed. I was wondering if you'd ever come back. She had owned the flower shop next door when I was a kid. My mother bought roses from her almost every weekend. We hugged awkwardly, the way people do when too many years have passed. You look just like Margaret, she said. I smiled. I've been hearing that my whole life. And it's still true. She looked at me for another moment before asking the question I knew was coming. So, are you helping run Seabrook Manor now? I shook my head. No. Her smile faded just a little. Oh. Before the silence became uncomfortable, another voice joined in. Eleanor Whitmore? An older man stepped out of the cafe carrying 2 paper cups. It was Mr. Lewis, who used to own the fishing charter near the marina. I'll be darned, he said. Margaret's girl. I couldn't help smiling. It's good to see you. The town's missed you. That surprised me. I don't think anyone noticed I was gone. He looked genuinely confused. Of course they did. Mrs. Donnelly nodded. Your mother did so much for this town. People remember. Neither of them mentioned my father, or Celeste, or Madison. Every story they shared somehow circled back to my mom. The charity dinners she'd organized, the local artists she invited to display their work at the inn, the scholarships she quietly funded for high school seniors. I realized something standing there on that sidewalk. Around here, Seabrook Manor still belonged to Margaret in people's memories. Not because of paperwork, because of what she had built. After saying goodbye, I wandered a little farther through town. A few more people recognized me. Some waved. Some stopped to chat. One elderly couple even asked if the inn was bringing back the summer garden tours my mother used to host. I hated admitting I had no idea. I've been away for a while, I said. They exchanged a quick glance before politely changing the subject. That tiny moment stayed with me longer than I expected. The farther I walked, the more I realized I'd spent 5 years assuming everyone had forgotten my mother. They hadn't. I was the one who had disappeared. If you've ever returned to a hometown after years away, you probably know that strange feeling. Everything looks familiar, yet somehow you feel like the visitor. That's exactly how I felt. By late afternoon, I finally got back into my car and drove the last few minutes towards Seabrook Manor. The entrance looked even more polished than I remembered. Fresh landscaping, new stone lighting, luxury cars lined the circular driveway. From a distance it looked successful, expensive, perfect. But something about it felt staged. Like a beautiful photograph that had been edited just a little too much. I handed my invitation to the valet. He glanced at my name, then back at me. Welcome to Seabrook Manor, Ms. Whitmore. His smile was professional, but I caught a flicker of recognition. For a brief second, I wondered if he'd heard stories about me. Or about my mother. I stepped onto the front walkway and slowed my pace without meaning to. This was the path my mom used to sweep herself before every big event. She always said the first impression started before guests reached the door. I could almost hear her reminding the staff to straighten the flower beds one last time. I took a deep breath and walked inside. The lobby was brighter than I remembered. The furniture had changed. The colors were different. Everything looked newer. Then my eyes drifted to the wall beside the entrance. I stopped walking. The brass plaque my mother had insisted every guest should see was gone. I stood there for a few seconds, staring at the empty space on the wall. It wasn't just decoration. For as long as I could remember, a brass plaque had welcomed every guest who walked through those doors. It read, "Built with care, preserved by those who remember." My mother insisted it stay there forever. Now, all that remained was a lighter patch on the wall where it used to hang. "Miss Whitmore?" I turned and saw a young employee holding a tray of champagne. "Would you like a glass?" I smiled politely. "I'm good, thank you." As I stepped farther into the lobby, familiar faces slowly began to appear. Not guests. Employees. A housekeeper stopped folding napkins the moment she recognized me. "Eleanor?" Her face lit up. "I can't believe you're here." "Hi, Linda." She laughed softly. "You still remember my name?" "Of course I do." Linda had worked here since I was in middle school. She used to sneak extra cookies onto my plate whenever Mom wasn't looking. For a moment, it almost felt normal again. Then I noticed something. Linda kept glancing over my shoulder while we talked, like she was checking to make sure nobody important was watching. Another employee walked by and gave me a quick smile. No words. Just a small nod before continuing down the hallway. It happened again with another staff member. Friendly, careful, almost cautious. I finally asked Linda, "Is everything okay?" She hesitated. Then she forced a smile. "Oh, you know how busy gala nights are." It wasn't an answer. Before I could ask anything else, a familiar voice came from across the lobby. "Eleanor." I turned. Samuel. His hair had turned almost completely gray since I'd last seen him, but I'd recognize him anywhere. He'd been the resort's senior maintenance technician for over 30 years. When I was little, he taught me how to sand old wood without ruining the grain. He opened his arms. I hugged him without thinking. "It's good to see you," he said quietly. "You too." He took one step back and looked around before lowering his voice. "You've noticed the changes." I nodded. I noticed one immediately. His eyes drifted toward the empty wall. "So you saw it. What happened?" Samuel didn't answer right away. Instead, he motioned for me to follow him a few steps toward the side of the lobby where the crowd was thinner. "The renovations weren't all bad," he said carefully. "Some rooms really did need updating." I appreciated that he wasn't pretending everything had been terrible. "But?" I asked. He sighed. "Some things weren't renovated. They were erased." Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then he leaned in just enough that no one else could hear. "The plaque wasn't thrown away." I blinked. "What?" "I couldn't let that happen." "You mean, it's still here?" For a second, I honestly forgot where I was. "You kept it?" Samuel gave the smallest nod. "Not just me." That caught my attention. "There are still people here who remember your mother." His words weren't dramatic. They were almost matter of fact. But somehow they carried more weight because of that. I looked around the room again. Suddenly, all those quiet smiles from the staff made a little more sense. Samuel started to say something else. "I can show you where—" "Eleanor!" The cheerful voice cut through the conversation before he could finish. I turned to see Madison Avery walking toward us with a bright smile that looked practiced enough for a magazine cover. She opened her arms as if we were cousins seeing each other at Thanksgiving. "There you are," she said. "I was wondering when you'd arrive." I gave her a polite smile. "Hi, Madison." She hugged me lightly before I had much chance to react. "It's been forever." "It has." Her attention shifted to Samuel. "Oh, Samuel, I hope we're not stealing you away from work." He straightened immediately. "Of course not. I was just welcoming Eleanor back." Madison smiled again, but something about it felt calculated. "Well, we'll have plenty of time to catch up later." She slipped her arm through mine. "Come on, there are so many people I'd love for you to meet." I glanced back at Samuel. For the briefest moment, he held my eyes. Then, almost too quietly to hear, he said, There's something you should see. Just not tonight. Madison guided me into the ballroom like we were old friends. She introduced me to donors, business partners, and local officials with the same polished smile. "This is Eleanor," she said more than once. "She lives in Boston now. She's in design." Not once did she say I was Margaret Whitmore's daughter. It was subtle. Most people probably wouldn't have noticed. I did. The ballroom looked beautiful, but it didn't feel like Seabrook Manor anymore. The floral arrangements were modern instead of seasonal. The live piano had been replaced with a string quartet. Even the welcome slideshow playing across two large screens featured recent renovations, celebrity guests, and awards. Not one photo of the woman who built the place. I kept scanning the walls. Every framed portrait of my mother was gone. I finally turned to Madison. "Where are the founder photos?" Her smile barely changed. "We updated the decor." I noticed. "We wanted a cleaner look." I looked around again. "So history no longer fits the design?" Before she could answer, another voice joined us. I was wondering when we'd finally talk. Celeste. She looked elegant, confident, completely at ease, greeting guests as if she'd always belonged here. "Eleanor," she said warmly, "it was kind of you to come." "You sent the invitation?" She smiled. "I thought it was time." There was something rehearsed about the conversation. Every word sounded pleasant. None of it felt genuine. "I've been looking around," I said. "I can see that. My mother's photographs are gone. We refreshed the public spaces. And the plaque? A redesign required a few changes." I held her gaze. "My mother founded this place." Celeste folded her hands calmly, and we're grateful for that. The answer sounded perfect. It also answered nothing. "You renamed the community fund too, didn't you?" A brief pause. "Yes." "Why?" "Because organizations evolve." I couldn't help asking one more question. Did anything from my mother stay exactly where she left it? For the first time, her smile faded. "Eleanor, businesses can't survive by living in the past." My mother wasn't the past. A few nearby conversations began to quiet down. People weren't openly staring yet, but they were listening. Celeste noticed it too. "I think tonight should be about celebrating the future." I agree. "Then let's do that." By pretending the founder never existed? The silence around us grew heavier. She stepped a little closer. "I think you're letting emotions cloud your judgment. And I think someone's trying very hard to erase hers." Neither of us raised our voices. We didn't have to. The room had already changed. Guests were pretending not to watch while clearly watching. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my father walking toward us. For 1 second, I actually felt relieved. He had to say something now. "Dad." He looked tired, older than I remembered. "Eleanor." I waited. Instead of asking what happened, he quietly said, "Can we not do this tonight?" I stared at him. "I'm asking about Mom." "I know." "So answer me." He rubbed his forehead. "This isn't the time." I felt something sink inside me. Not anger, disappointment. 5 years had passed. Nothing had changed. Celeste gave him a quick glance before looking back at me. "I think it's best if we end this conversation." "I'm not the one ending it." "No." She turned toward one of the security supervisors standing near the entrance. "You can escort Miss Whitmore out." For a second, I honestly thought I'd misheard her. The supervisor hesitated. "So, now?" "Yes." The music kept playing. People looked away the second I noticed them watching. 2 security guards approached carefully. Neither of them seemed comfortable. One of them spoke almost apologetically. "Ma'am." I raised a hand before he could finish. "It's okay." Then I looked at my father one last time. He finally met my eyes. "Eleanor." His voice was barely above a whisper. "Please don't make a scene." That hurt more than being asked to leave, because in that moment he wasn't choosing between me and Celeste. He was choosing comfort over truth. I walked past the guests, past the lobby, past the empty place where my mother's brass plaque used to hang. No one stopped me. The drive back was quiet. The invitation sat on the passenger seat beside me, already feeling like it belonged to someone else. By the time I reached my apartment, I knew I was done waiting for answers from people who refused to give them. There was one thing I had avoided touching since my mother's funeral: an old wooden chest sitting in the back of my storage room. I stood in front of it for a long moment, then reached for the lid. The lid creaked the moment I lifted it. I hadn't opened that wooden chest since the week after my mother's funeral. At first, I told myself I wasn't ready. Then 1 year became 2. 2 became 5. Eventually, it wasn't grief keeping it closed. It was habit. I carried the chest into my living room, made a cup of coffee, and sat cross-legged on the floor. There was no plan. I was just going to go through it one box at a time. The first thing I found was an old photo album. The cover was worn around the edges, but everything inside had been carefully organized. There were pictures from the early days of Seabrook Manor, before the gardens, before the renovations, before anyone called it a luxury inn. I smiled when I found a photo of my mother wearing paint-covered overalls, laughing while standing on a ladder with a paint roller in one hand. She looked happier there than in any formal portrait. Another picture showed the two of us planting flowers near the front entrance. I couldn't have been older than 8. I remembered complaining because I wanted to play instead. Mom just laughed and said, "One day you'll brag that you planted those." She wasn't wrong. I kept turning pages. There were handwritten notes tucked between the photographs, paint color samples, garden sketches, lists of local contractors, small reminders written in her neat handwriting. Call Samuel about porch railing. Order more roses before Memorial Day. Check on Mrs. Donnelly's fundraiser. It wasn't just a business. It was her life. Around lunchtime, I realized I'd been sitting on the floor for nearly 4 hours. My coffee had gone cold. I ordered takeout, ate absent-mindedly, and went right back to sorting through the boxes. Some things made me laugh. A tiny seashell I insisted was rare. A handmade birthday card I'd drawn with far more enthusiasm than talent. An old room key with a faded brass tag. Other things were harder. Hospital paperwork, medical appointment reminders, the kind of documents nobody wants to keep, but somehow can't throw away. Near the bottom of the chest sat a leather folder I didn't recognize. Inside were several envelopes, all neatly labeled. One simply said, "For Eleanor." My hands slowed. The paper looked old, but the handwriting was unmistakable. I unfolded the letter carefully. It wasn't long. It didn't mention money. It didn't mention the inn, at least, not directly. Instead, it sounded exactly like my mother. Calm, practical, steady. She wrote about change, about how every building needed repairs because time never stopped moving. Then she wrote something that made me stop reading for a second. A home should survive the people who built it. I read the sentence again, then once more. She wasn't talking about walls or furniture. She meant the values behind them, the kindness, the purpose, the people. By the end of the letter, she hadn't given me instructions. She'd simply reminded me not to let guilt make my decisions. I sat there quietly for a while, holding the paper. It felt less like reading an old letter and more like having one last conversation with her. When I finally looked back inside the folder, something else caught my attention. A business card had slipped between 2 envelopes. The name read, Helen Foster Independent Fiduciary Services. There was an office number, a direct line, and an address in Portland. I frowned. I didn't recognize the name at all. I searched the folder again, expecting another explanation. Instead, I found a small, sticky note attached to the back of the card, in my mother's handwriting. If you ever need answers I can't give you myself, start with Helen. That was it. No explanation, no context, just one sentence. I leaned back against the couch and looked at the card for several minutes. Part of me wanted to put everything back into the chest. Maybe this was just paperwork my mother never got around to organizing. Maybe Helen had handled insurance, or taxes, or something completely ordinary. I almost convinced myself to leave it alone. Then I remembered standing in the ballroom, the missing plaque, the missing photographs, my father's silence. I looked at the business card one more time. If my mother had kept it with a letter meant only for me, it probably wasn't there by accident. I picked up my phone. The office was likely closed by now, but the direct number was still printed underneath Helen's name. I took a slow breath and pressed call. The phone rang 3 times before someone answered. Helen Foster speaking. Her voice was calm, older, and surprisingly warm. Hi, my name is Eleanor Whitmore. There was a brief pause. I found your business card among my mother's belongings. Another short silence. Then she asked gently, Margaret's daughter? Yes. I've wondered when you might call. That wasn't the response I expected. You knew my mother? I worked with her for many years. I glanced at the letter still lying open on my coffee table. I think she wanted me to speak with you. I believe she did. Helen didn't ask many questions over the phone. Instead, she said, Bring everything you found. Letters, documents, even the things that don't seem important. Is this about the inn? It may be. That was all she would say. We agreed to meet the following morning at her office in Portland. The drive there felt very different from the one to Seabrook Manor. I wasn't replaying arguments in my head. I was trying to figure out why my mother had trusted someone I'd never even heard of. Helen's office wasn't inside a fancy downtown tower. It was a quiet brick building overlooking a small park. Simple, organized, comfortable. When I walked in, she stood to greet me. She looked to be in her late 60s, wearing reading glasses on a chain around her neck. Eleanor. She smiled kindly. You have your mother's eyes. I've been hearing that a lot lately. I imagine you have. She offered me coffee before we talked about anything else. For the first 15 minutes, it barely felt like a business meeting. She asked about my work, my apartment, whether I still enjoyed restoring old buildings. When I told her what I did for a living, she smiled. Margaret would have loved that. You really knew her. I did. Helen folded her hands. Your mother wasn't someone who made quick decisions. I laughed softly. That sounds familiar. If Margaret signed a document, she'd probably read it 10 times first. That sounded exactly right. Helen looked through the folder I'd brought with me, stopping now and then to read a note or study a photograph. She handled every page carefully, almost respectfully. Finally, she looked up. She kept more than I expected. What exactly did you help her with? I helped her protect what she built. I frowned. I don't understand. You will. She opened a locked file cabinet behind her desk and pulled out a thick binder. It looked old, but perfectly organized. She placed it between us without opening it right away. Margaret believed successful businesses don't just need good management. They need protection. Protection from what? Time. She smiled. And sometimes, people. The room suddenly felt much quieter. Helen opened the binder. The first pages contained legal documents I didn't recognize, property records, formation papers, professional signatures. Everything looked official. She turned several pages before stopping. This, she said, tapping the page gently, is the document your mother spent nearly 2 years preparing. Across the top, in bold letters, were the words, Whitmore Heritage Trust. I looked at Helen. I've never heard of this. I'm not surprised. Why? Because your mother didn't want anyone discussing it until the right time. I felt my stomach tighten. Helen continued. Seabrook Manor isn't personally owned by your father. I stared at her. What? The operating company your father manages leases the property. I blinked. They lease it? Yes. The land, the buildings, and the historic estate belong to this trust. I honestly thought I'd misunderstood. Then, who owns the trust? Helen looked directly at me. Your mother established it before she passed away. She turned another page. The trust has always had a managing trustee. I leaned closer. And who is that? For many years, it was an independent fiduciary office. She gave me a small smile. My office. Nothing about this made sense anymore. If you've been managing it, I was never meant to do it forever. She slowly slid one final page toward me. Near the bottom was a clause highlighted decades earlier. I read it once, then again. The words refused to make sense. Upon Eleanor Whitmore reaching the age of 35, the role of primary trustee shall automatically transfer to her without further approval or amendment. I looked up at Helen. I turned 35 last week. I know. She nodded gently. Which means, Eleanor. Before I could ask another question, Helen rested her hand on the binder. You haven't seen the most important pages yet. Helen turned the next page and slid the binder closer to me. This is where most people stop reading, she said with a small smile. Margaret never did. I couldn't help smiling back. That sounds like her. For the next hour, we went through the trust one section at a time. Helen translated the legal language into plain English. The trust wasn't just about ownership. It was about preservation. My mother hadn't created it simply to protect a building. She had written down the principles she wanted the inn to follow long after she was gone. I stopped at one paragraph. The name, I read quietly. Helen nodded. Read it again. I did. The property shall continue operating under the name Seabrook Manor unless extraordinary circumstances make continued operation impossible. I looked up. They weren't supposed to change anything? They could renovate. They could modernize. But they couldn't erase its identity. Another clause caught my attention. It specifically mentioned the brass plaque, the same plaque that had disappeared from the lobby. Its wording was surprisingly clear. The founder's dedication plaque was to remain permanently displayed near the main entrance as part of the property's historical record. I felt my jaw tighten. They actually wrote this into a legal document? No, Helen corrected gently. Your mother did. We kept reading. The community fund was next. I recognized the name immediately. Whitmore Community Fund. Helen reached into another folder and placed a recent brochure beside the trust. I looked at both documents. The difference jumped out immediately. The brochure now read, Avery Legacy Circle. They renamed it, I said. Yes. And the trust specifically says, it must continue under its original purpose and identity. I slowly leaned back in my chair. So changing the name wasn't just disrespectful. Helen nodded. It may also be a breach of the trust agreement. That word stayed with me. Breach. I'd been thinking about this emotionally. Helen was looking at it legally. She continued making notes as we compared the trust to photos from the gala and current promotional materials. One by one, the list grew. The missing plaque, the missing founder portraits, the renamed charity program. Historical displays removed. Marketing that no longer acknowledged Margaret as the founder. Each item seemed small by itself. Together, they painted a very different picture. I rubbed my forehead. I spent 5 years believing I had no place there. Helen closed the binder. Eleanor. She waited until I looked at her. You've been acting like someone who was pushed out. I nodded. You need to start thinking like the person your mother trusted to protect her legacy. No one had ever said anything like that to me. Not my father. Not anyone. For the first time since leaving Seabrook Manor, I wasn't replaying the humiliation in my head. I was thinking about responsibility. There was a difference. I don't want revenge, I said. I know. I don't want to destroy the business. I know. I looked down at the binder. I don't want people pretending she never existed. Helen smiled softly. Then we're working toward the same goal. She opened her laptop. The first step isn't a lawsuit. It isn't? No. She began drafting a formal notice. A document explaining that the trust had identified several possible violations and requesting they be corrected within the required time frame. It gives them the opportunity to comply voluntarily, she explained. Your mother believed people should always have the chance to do the right thing first. That sounded exactly like Margaret. We spent another hour reviewing every sentence. Helen asked for my approval before adding my name as the newly appointed trustee. Seeing my name beside that title felt strange, almost unreal. Before I left, she printed the final draft and placed it neatly inside a large envelope. I'll have this sent by certified mail. I nodded. Thank you. No, she said. I think your mother would want me to thank you. For what? For showing up? I drove home feeling lighter than I had in years, not because the problems were solved. They weren't. But for the first time, I knew where I stood. I wasn't an unwanted guest. I wasn't the daughter who had been pushed aside. I had a responsibility, and I intended to honor it. The envelope from Helen had barely left her office when another envelope was waiting in my mailbox. It was thicker, addressed directly to me. The return address belonged to a law firm I had never heard of. I unlocked my front door, carried it inside, and stared at it for several seconds before carefully tearing it open. The envelope contained a cover letter from an attorney I didn't recognize. The first sentence made my stomach drop. It stated that the Whitmore Heritage Trust had been amended several years earlier and that any claim I believed I had was no longer valid. I read it twice. Then I pulled out the attached documents. There it was. An amendment. Typed neatly. Stamped. Signed. At least, it looked that way. My heart started racing. Had I misunderstood everything? Had Helen? I grabbed the trust binder from my dining table and flipped between the original pages and the copies from the envelope. I wasn't a lawyer. To me, they looked close enough to be real. For the first time since leaving Helen's office, doubt crept back in. I picked up my phone. She answered before the second ring. Eleanor? I just received something. Her voice immediately changed. Don't respond to it. I wasn't planning to. Can you bring it to me? I'm leaving now. By the time I reached her office, she'd already cleared a space on her desk. She didn't rush. That surprised me. I expected panic. Instead, she put on her reading glasses and quietly began comparing every page. The room stayed silent except for the sound of paper turning. I watched her expression more than the documents. She wasn't alarmed. She was studying. Finally, she set one page aside. Interesting. What? She pointed to the date. This notarization doesn't match the filing schedule used in this county. I frowned. Is that important? It can be. She turned another page. A minute later, she tapped the margin. This legal reference wasn't even being used in trust documents when this claims to have been drafted. I blinked. You can tell that just by looking? Helen smiled slightly. I've been doing this for over 30 years. She kept going. The witness signatures weren't formatted the same way as the originals. The page numbers didn't match the trust's indexing system. One signature belonged to someone who had retired before the supposed amendment date. None of those details meant much to me on their own. Together, they painted a different picture. I leaned forward. So, Helen closed the folder. I don't believe this amendment is authentic. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. So the trust still stands? As far as I can tell, yes. But someone wanted me to think otherwise. She nodded. And they wanted you to believe it before our notice reached them. That thought settled over the room. This wasn't just a disagreement anymore. Someone had gone to the trouble of preparing documents convincing enough to make me back down. If I'd received this a week ago, I admitted, I probably would have believed it. I know. And I would have walked away. Helen looked at me for a moment. That's exactly why these kinds of documents get sent. Not always to win, sometimes just to make someone give up. I looked at the forged amendment again. It suddenly felt less intimidating than it had an hour earlier. Whoever sent it had counted on one thing, that I wouldn't ask questions. Helen carefully placed the papers into a separate folder. I'll have our legal team examine every page. Do you think we should contact the attorney who sent this? Eventually. But not until we know exactly what we're dealing with. Her confidence was steady. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. And somehow, that made me trust her even more. Before I left, she handed the envelope back to me. Keep everything. I will. No matter how insignificant it seems. The drive home felt different again. I wasn't scared anymore. I was paying attention. Someone had made a move. That meant they were worried enough to try. I had barely set my keys on the kitchen counter when my phone buzzed. The screen showed a name I hadn't expected. Samuel. I answered immediately. Samuel? His voice was low, almost cautious. I think it's time. Time for what? A brief pause. I told you there was something I couldn't show you that night. I remember. It's still here. What is? The plaque. Another pause. I've kept it safe all these years. He lowered his voice even further. If you're ready, I'll show you where it's been hidden. I can be there in 2 hours, I told Samuel. I'll be waiting. He didn't say anything else before ending the call. By the time I reached Seabrook Manor, the evening crowd had already disappeared. The parking lot was quiet, and most of the lights inside had been dimmed. Samuel met me near a side entrance employees used instead of the main lobby. He looked around before unlocking the door. We won't bother anyone this way. I followed him through a maze of service hallways I'd almost forgotten existed. Everything smelled faintly of fresh paint and old wood. Do they know you're here? I asked. He smiled. They know I'm working late. That was answer enough. We eventually stopped in front of a heavy storage room door. Samuel pulled a ring of old keys from his pocket. I've had these longer than some of the managers have worked here. The lock clicked open. The room wasn't fancy. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with old furniture, framed artwork, seasonal decorations, and boxes labeled in faded handwriting. It looked less like storage, and more like a room where memories had been quietly placed out of sight. Samuel walked toward the back without saying a word. Then he carefully lifted a folded canvas cloth off a long rectangular object. My breath caught. The brass plaque. It was exactly the one I'd remembered. A little tarnished around the edges, but still beautiful. Samuel brushed away a thin layer of dust with his sleeve. The engraved words slowly came into view. Built with care, preserved by those who remember. I reached out and ran my fingers lightly across the metal. I thought it was gone. So did most people. You saved it? He shook his head. We saved it. I looked at him. What do you mean? Samuel leaned against one of the shelves. The order came down to remove anything connected to your mother's branding. The plaque. The portraits. A few historical displays. He shrugged. Some things disappeared before they reached the dumpster. I couldn't help smiling. You stole them. He laughed. I prefer to think we rescued them. That made me laugh too. For the first time in weeks, It felt genuine. There were a few of us, he continued. Linda from housekeeping, Mark in maintenance, even one of the kitchen supervisors. We couldn't stop every change. But we couldn't stand by and watch 30 years of history thrown away. I looked around the room again. Several framed photographs rested against one wall. One showed my mother shaking hands with the town mayor during the inn's reopening. Another captured the first community fundraiser she'd organized. They hadn't been destroyed. Someone had protected them. I thought everyone just accepted what happened, I admitted. Samuel slowly shook his head. Most people still work here because they need the job. That doesn't mean they forgot who built this place. His words stayed with me. For years, I'd believed I was the only one still holding on to my mother's memory. I had been wrong. She was still present in quiet conversations, in people who refused to throw certain things away, in employees who kept their heads down but never let go of their respect for her. I wasn't standing alone anymore. Samuel carefully covered the plaque again. One day, he said softly, it belongs back where people can see it. I looked at him. I think so too. He smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. We locked the storage room and walked back through the employee hallway. Just before we reached the exit, Linda stepped out of the laundry room carrying folded towels. She froze when she saw me. Then she smiled. It's good to see you again. You too. She glanced toward Samuel. I'm glad she finally knows. Neither of them explained what she meant. They didn't have to. As I walked to my car, I realized something had quietly changed. The inn still had people willing to protect what my mother had built. Maybe they had been waiting for someone else to do the same. I had just started the engine when my phone rang. Dad. I stared at his name for a few seconds before answering. Hello? His voice sounded tired. Are you busy? I just left the inn. There was a long pause. I'd like to see you. I didn't answer right away. Eleanor. His voice was softer than I'd heard in years. There's something I should have told you. Years ago. My father chose a small seafood restaurant overlooking the marina. It wasn't fancy. Just a quiet place where fishermen stop for coffee before sunrise, and tourists usually overlooked. He was already sitting by the window when I walked in. For a second, he looked relieved to see me. Thank you for coming? I nodded and took the seat across from him. I almost didn't. I know. A waitress poured coffee into our cups before either of us touched the menus. Neither of us had come for dinner. We both knew that. Dad wrapped both hands around his mug without taking a sip. You've been talking to Helen. It wasn't a question. Yes. He looked out toward the boats rocking gently in the harbor. So, you know about the trust? I do. He closed his eyes for a moment. I always hoped this conversation would never happen. I leaned back in my chair. I don't think that's something to hope for. No. His voice was barely above a whisper. It isn't. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he looked at me. I owe you the truth. I waited. When your mother became sick, she started putting everything in order. I remember. She asked me to sit in on several meetings with Helen. That caught my attention. You were there? He nodded. I knew exactly what the trust was. The words landed harder than I expected. You knew? I did. You knew for all these years? Yes. I stared at him. So, when Celeste changed the name? Silence. When the plaque disappeared? He lowered his head. Silence again. And when I was escorted out of Mom's inn? His jaw tightened. I knew. I looked away before I said something I'd regret. Outside, a fishing boat drifted slowly toward the dock. People kept walking past the restaurant windows, completely unaware that my entire understanding of the last 5 years had just changed. I thought you didn't know, I finally said. I wanted to believe that. Dad nodded slowly. I understand. No. I looked back at him. I don't think you do. He didn't argue. Instead, he quietly admitted, I convinced myself that staying silent was protecting everyone. Everyone? I had already lost your mother. His voice cracked for the first time. I couldn't bear the thought of losing another family. I understood what he meant. I really did. After Mom died, he'd been lonely. Celeste had come into his life when he was grieving. I could understand why he wanted peace, but understanding wasn't the same as accepting it. So you chose silence? Yes. You watched pieces of Mom disappear one by one. I kept telling myself they were only cosmetic changes. The logo. The photos. The community fund. The plaque. They weren't cosmetic. He rubbed his forehead. I know that now. No. I shook my head gently. You knew then. The difference mattered. He didn't deny it. That hurt more than any excuse could have. I'm sorry, Eleanor. I've said those words to myself 1,000 times. I should have stopped it. You could have. I know. His honesty made the conversation quieter. There wasn't much left to argue about. The damage had already been done. After a long silence, he asked, Are you really going through with this? The legal process? Yes. I answered without hesitation. Yes. He looked disappointed but not surprised. It will change everything. I folded my hands on the table. It already has. I'm not trying to take your business away. I know. I'm trying to protect what Mom spent her life building. He slowly nodded. I believe you. Those 3 words meant more than I expected. For years, it felt like he had only listened to one side. Now, for the first time, he was actually hearing mine. I don't hate you, I said quietly. His eyes met mine. But I can't keep pretending your silence didn't have consequences. He looked down at his coffee. I suppose this is the price of waiting too long. Neither of us smiled. When we stood outside the restaurant, he hesitated before speaking again. I hope someday you'll forgive me. I hope someday you'll forgive yourself. He gave a small nod before walking toward his car. I watched him drive away, feeling strangely lighter. Nothing had been fixed. But at least the truth was finally standing in the open. By the time I reached home, the porch light was already on. I frowned. I didn't remember leaving it on. Then I saw 2 familiar figures standing beside my front steps. Celeste and Madison. Neither of them had called. Neither of them looked like they planned to leave anytime soon. Celeste didn't bother with a greeting. The moment I opened my front door, she stepped forward. So this is what you've been doing. Madison stood a few feet behind her with her arms crossed. I invited neither of you, I said. We're here because you've gone too far. I don't think I have, Celeste laughed. You're trying to steal this family's business. I opened the door wider. If you're going to accuse me of something, come inside. Neither of us wanted the neighbors listening. We sat at my dining table, the same table where I'd spent days sorting through my mother's boxes. Celeste wasted no time. You've turned your father against us? You've threatened the company. And now you're hiding behind paperwork. I let her finish. Then I placed 4 folders on the table. The original trust, the operating agreement, the notice Helen had prepared, and a record of every change made to Seabrook Manor. I didn't create these. I slid the trust toward her. My mother did. It doesn't matter, she said. It does. A knock interrupted us. Helen walked in with another attorney. A moment later, Celeste's own lawyer arrived after reviewing the notice we'd sent. The room became quiet. Nobody argued anymore. Everyone read. After several minutes, Celeste's attorney closed the final folder. I need to speak with you privately. You can say it here, Celeste replied. He sighed. I don't believe continuing this dispute is in your best interest. What? The trust appears valid. The operating company leases Seabrook Manor. It doesn't own it. He looked at me. Ms. Whitmore is the acting trustee. Celeste stared at him. That's impossible. I don't believe it is. And the amendment? We can't rely on it. Silence filled the room. For the first time, Celeste looked uncertain. Her attorney packed his files. I'll be withdrawing from this matter unless new evidence appears. He nodded politely and walked out. Madison looked at me. So, what happens now? I'm not closing the inn. Both of them looked surprised. I never wanted that. I want Seabrook Manor to stay open. I want the staff to keep their jobs. Celeste frowned. Then what do you want? I want my mother's wishes respected. Over the next few weeks, the transition began. The operating company stayed in place, but now it answered to the trust. The original Seabrook Manor name returned. The Whitmore Community Fund was restored. Scholarship applications reopened for local students. Some people welcomed the changes, others didn't. Life moved on. One Saturday morning, Samuel asked me to meet him at the front entrance. Linda, Mark, and several longtime employees were already there. Samuel carefully unwrapped the brass plaque. Together, we mounted it beside the front doors. No speeches, no ceremony. Just a handful of people quietly returning something that never should have been removed. When Samuel tightened the last screw, we stepped back. The morning sunlight reflected off the brass, built with care, preserved by those who remember. Linda smiled, wiped away a tear, and went back to work. Dad and I still have awkward conversations. Trust takes longer to rebuild than a building. Every few weeks he calls and asks if I want lunch. It's a start. Celeste left town a few months later. Madison sent me one email. I wish things had happened differently. So do I. I still walk through Seabrook Manor, but I don't think about owning it. I think about protecting what my mother believed was worth saving. What would you have done in my place? I'd love to hear your thoughts. And tell me where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel.